My name is Sarah, and I've always been a woman who valued logic and reason above all. Growing up, faith wasn't a priority in my life. My family wasn't particularly religious, and I spent my adult years focused on my career and raising my daughter, Lily. John, my husband, tried to talk to me about God, but I could never fully embrace the idea of something beyond what I could see and touch. I would listen politely, but I didn't really believe. The world made sense to me through science and experience, not through scripture or spiritual revelation. Life felt secure in its predictability. Every day was like the one before, waking up early to work, making sure Lily was ready for school, and spending evenings in front of the TV or with friends, sipping wine and talking about the daily grind. I was content in a way, but I also knew something was missing. There was a quiet emptiness in my heart, a feeling I couldn't explain, but I didn't know how to fill it. It wasn't until that one fateful moment, when I died, that everything changed. Before I continue, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let me share how it all began. It all happened so suddenly. One moment, I was driving home from work, listening to my favorite podcast about world events, and the next, I was fighting for air, trapped in the most terrifying situation I could imagine. I remember it clearly, a sharp pain in my chest, followed by a feeling of dizziness. My vision blurred, and before I could even process what was happening, my hands began to tremble uncontrollably on the steering wheel. I tried to call for help, but my voice was weak. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, struggling to breathe. The world went dark. It wasn't like any death I had imagined. It wasn't a cold, empty void. Instead, I felt a strange sense of weightlessness, like I was floating, detached from everything I knew. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't know if I was alive or dead. My heart wasn't beating, my lungs weren't filling with air, but my mind was still active, still aware. And then, I saw him. A light appeared, brighter than any light I had ever seen, so pure and so radiant that it felt like it was filling every corner of my being. I thought at first it was just a vision, something my brain was creating to comfort me in my last moments. But as the light dimmed, I saw a figure standing before me. It was Jesus. His face was unlike anything I had ever imagined. I had heard descriptions of him, read about him in the Bible, seen paintings of the kind man with long hair and a soft expression. But this was not the gentle, abstract image I had always believed in. This was a real person. His skin, glowing and vibrant, had a deep, rich tone, nothing like the pale depictions I had grown up with. His features were strong, regal even, yet filled with the most overwhelming sense of compassion. I remember my heart racing in confusion. I had always thought I knew what he looked like, but this man before me was so much more than I could have ever imagined. His eyes, piercing and full of wisdom, looked into mine, and in that gaze, I felt as if he knew every single part of my life. The shame, the doubts, the guilt, all of it laid bare before him. But there was no condemnation in his eyes, only an invitation. I wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but no words came. It was as though everything I thought I knew about God, about Jesus, was being dismantled right in front of me. It was as if he was showing me his true form, his true face, not the image I had seen in church or in the media, but the raw, authentic being who stood before me in all his glory. And I couldn't deny it. It was him. I remember the words he spoke, soft but powerful. "Sarah, do you believe?" I wanted to shout, to cry, to fall to my knees and beg for forgiveness. But instead I just stood there, frozen in awe, my mind struggling to keep up with the enormity of what I was witnessing. It didn't make sense. How could this be real? How could this vibrant, powerful, living being in front of me be the same person I had so casually dismissed for years? The man I had reduced to a figure in a book, a myth, a character in stories from my childhood. As I floated in that liminal space between life and death, I felt the enormity of my disbelief, of the years I had spent doubting, questioning, and pushing God away. But more than anything, I felt his love. It wasn't conditional. It wasn't based on what I had done or hadn't done. It was the kind of love I had never known before. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I awoke with a start, gasping for air, heart pounding in my chest, my body lying on the cold pavement. But everything inside me was different. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know what to believe anymore. What had just happened? Was it a hallucination, a near-death dream, or had I truly seen Jesus? The questions flooded my mind, but the one thing I knew with absolute certainty was that my life would never be the same again. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It was all I could think about, the vision, the feeling, the unexplainable peace that had washed over me when I saw him. But the more I thought about it, the more my mind tried to tear it apart. Maybe it was just a dream, a hallucination, a trick of my subconscious as it tried to make sense of the fear I'd felt when my body was failing me. That's what I told myself anyway, trying to convince myself that the experience didn't change anything. But the truth was, something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jesus was real, that what I had experienced wasn't just a random figment of my imagination. I tried to go back to normal life, but it was like I was wearing different glasses. Everything looked the same, but somehow nothing felt the same. I had always been skeptical about faith and the Bible. Even though John, my husband, had tried to talk to me about God for years, I had never really understood why he had such a deep connection to Jesus. But now I found myself listening to him in a new way. His prayers no longer felt like something distant or unnecessary. They felt like something I needed. I had to talk to God. I had to understand who he really was and what he wanted from me. But when I shared what had happened with John, I was met with a silence that felt almost too heavy to bear. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice trembling a little. "You really saw him?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I did." John didn't respond immediately, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He had always believed in Jesus, but my experience was shaking him too. Was he supposed to believe me? Was this just a product of my near-death experience, or was it something more? That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, as the weight of what had happened settled deep inside me. I knew I wasn't the same person anymore, but the thought of sharing this newfound faith with others was terrifying. How could I explain this to people who had never doubted, people who were deeply rooted in their own beliefs? People like Maria, my best friend, who had always been a skeptic? I had already tried sharing some of my spiritual thoughts with her, but the look in her eyes said it all. She had listened to my words, nodded politely, but I could tell she didn't understand. Her eyes were filled with disbelief, maybe even pity. "Sarah," she had said with a soft chuckle one afternoon as we sat having coffee, "I know you're going through something, but this Jesus stuff, you're getting a little carried away." The words stung, even though I knew she wasn't trying to hurt me. But how could she understand? How could anyone understand this profound experience I had just lived through? How could they grasp the depths of the love I felt for Jesus now, when they had never truly seen him the way I had? I tried to push it all aside and return to my normal life. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the feelings grew. I started reading the Bible, slowly at first, unsure of what I was looking for. I was searching for something that would confirm what I had seen, something that would help me make sense of the experience that had altered my entire understanding of the world. John and I talked more, and he started to soften. He encouraged me to pray with him at night, even though it felt awkward at first. Still, it was clear that my husband was torn between his deep, unshakable faith and the woman he had married, who was now struggling to believe. It wasn't easy for him, and I could feel it. One night, after our daughter, Lily, had gone to bed, I sat with John, quietly holding his hand, both of us deep in thought. I asked him what he thought about what I'd seen. "I've always believed, Sarah, but now..." He hesitated, looking at me. "I don't know. What you're describing it's beyond anything I've ever heard, but it's also you, and I trust you." The words meant everything to me. It wasn't the confirmation I was hoping for, but it was a start. It was a small crack in the door of his skepticism, a sign that he, too, was willing to begin questioning everything we had thought we knew. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. It felt like the whole world was moving forward with its usual routines, while I was stuck, grappling with this enormous truth. I wanted to talk to someone who could understand, someone who had walked this path before me, but it was hard to find the words. At church, I found myself staring at the cross during every service. but my heart felt heavy. I didn't know how to explain to others that I had seen him, not in the way the church had taught me, but in the way he had revealed himself to me, so personal, so real. My transformation was only just beginning, but I was already beginning to realize how hard it would be to reconcile my new faith with my old life. It was a Sunday afternoon when the next major revelation came. I was sitting alone in my living room, the Bible open on my lap, feeling a strange mix of excitement and confusion. I had spent weeks trying to understand what had happened to me, trying to make sense of the visions, the emotions, and the overwhelming sense of Jesus' presence. But despite all my efforts, I still felt like something was missing. That afternoon, I began reading one of the Gospels, Matthew, I think, and suddenly a verse stood out to me. It was in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." I stopped. I couldn't explain why, but the words struck me like a lightning bolt. See God. The realization hit me. I had seen him, the real Jesus, the living, breathing Son of God. It wasn't a metaphor or a distant dream. I had stood before him and he had shown me his true face, his true skin, his true love. But it didn't end there. As I sat in stunned silence, the room suddenly felt charged with a strange energy. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was happening. It was like God himself was speaking to me, not audibly, but through a deep, undeniable impression in my heart. The words were clear. You are meant to share this truth. My heart raced as I processed what was happening. Share the truth? I had barely accepted it myself. How could I possibly tell others about my experience? How could I expect them to believe me? I was just a regular woman who had lived her life far away from faith, and now I was being asked to tell others about a Jesus I had only just come to know. But the more I tried to resist the message, the clearer it became. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a calling. I didn't fully understand what it meant or what it would require of me, but I knew in my soul that I couldn't ignore it. As if on cue, I heard a knock on the door. I opened it, and there stood Pastor James, a kind man who had been guiding John through his own spiritual journey. He had been noticing a change in me lately and had come to check in. I invited him in, unsure of what to say. My mind was still racing with the weight of what I had just experienced. "I've been praying for you, Sarah," Pastor James said with a smile, "and I felt compelled to visit today. I know you've been going through something powerful." I nodded, barely able to speak. He could see it in my eyes, the doubt, the fear, and the uncertainty that I hadn't yet found the courage to voice. "Sarah," he continued, his voice soft but firm, "sometimes when God reveals himself to us in such a profound way, it's not just for us, it's for others too. And he's called you to share that vision, to tell your story. You're not alone in this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Pastor James, who had been a rock for John, now seemed to be confirming everything I was feeling, everything I had feared. But something inside me shifted. There was peace in his words, a quiet reassurance that even though this calling was going to be difficult, I wasn't walking this path alone. With Pastor James' encouragement, I felt the courage begin to rise within me. Perhaps I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew this. I had seen the real Jesus, and I couldn't keep that to myself any longer. It was time to share my story. The first person I shared my decision with was John. After Pastor James left, I sat in silence for a while, reflecting on everything I had learned. I could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Telling John was the hardest part. He had been my partner, my companion, and my best friend. But now, I was about to tell him that the woman he had married was no longer the same, that my heart had been completely transformed. I found him in the kitchen, staring out the window, a mug of coffee in his hands. When I entered the room, he didn't even turn to look at me right away. The tension in the air was thick, like we were both waiting for the same moment to come. "John," I said, my voice shaky, "I've made up my mind. I'm going to share my experience with others. I can't keep it to myself anymore." He turned slowly, his face unreadable. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us heavy with unspoken questions. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I could feel his inner turmoil. He had always been a man of faith, but this was something different. What had happened to me was outside of his understanding, outside of what we had ever known. He had always believed in God, but this was something new. I think that's what God wants, John. I have to do it. I can't ignore it anymore. I watched his expression shift. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. His eyes were filled with concern, a mixture of love and fear. Sarah, I love you. I want to support you, but what are we really talking about here? You've seen something amazing, something you believe is real. But how do we even begin to explain this to anyone else? To our family? To our friends? It's going to shake everything, Sarah. It's going to shake me too. His words stung more than I wanted to admit, but I understood. John had always been steady, logical, and practical. The idea of sharing something so profound, so personal, was terrifying to him as much as it was to me. But I knew that my journey was leading me down a path where I couldn't go back. I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I couldn't unfeel the love I had experienced from Jesus. John, I said, my voice softening, I don't know what this will mean for us, but I know I'm not the same person anymore, and I don't want to live in fear of what people might think. He didn't respond right away, but his eyes softened. I could see him wrestling with the conflict inside himself. I'm scared, Sarah. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose what we have. I reached out, gently touching his arm. We won't lose each other, but we might have to change. I need you with me in this. He looked down at his hands, and for a moment I thought he might walk away from the conversation. But then he nodded, just a slight movement, as if agreeing to something he hadn't fully accepted yet. I'll be here, he said quietly, but I need time. I don't know what this all means for me, Sarah, but I'm not going anywhere. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. There was so much uncertainty in his voice, but there was also love. That was enough for now. Later that week, I ran into Maria at the grocery store. It had been a few days since I'd last seen her, and I hadn't yet told her what had happened. As soon as I saw her, I knew I couldn't keep it from her any longer. Maria had been my best friend for years. She knew me better than anyone, and I knew she would have a lot of questions, many of them challenging. We exchanged pleasantries before I told her I needed to talk. We walked to a small cafe nearby, and I told her everything. How I had died, how I had seen Jesus, and how it had all changed me. Maria listened intently, but I could see the disbelief in her eyes. So, you're saying you had some sort of vision or experience where you saw Jesus? She asked slowly, as if trying to make sense of my words. Yes, I replied, my voice unwavering, even though my heart was pounding. It was real, Maria. It wasn't just a dream or some crazy thought. I saw him, and I believe everything has changed. I've felt his love, and I know he's real. Maria leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. But Sarah, how can you be sure? What if this is just your mind playing tricks on you? You've been through a traumatic experience. Maybe it's just your body reacting to the stress of what happened. I could see the skepticism in her eyes, and it hurt more than I wanted to admit. Maria had always been the logical one, the one who believed only what she could see or touch. To her, faith was a fleeting thing, something that couldn't be proven. And what I was sharing with her was far beyond anything she had ever encountered. I don't know how to explain it, Maria. All I know is that I've experienced something real, something that has completely changed me. Maria was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was tinged with concern. I just don't know, Sarah. This is too much. I want to believe you, but it's hard to understand. I'm scared for you. Her words stung, but I knew she cared. She just couldn't see what I had seen, yet. As I began to share my testimony with more people, I quickly realized that the road ahead would be anything but easy. The further I ventured into my newfound faith, the more I encountered obstacles, both from within myself and from those around me. John's initial support was crucial, but I could sense his unease growing with each passing day. While he didn't outright reject my experience, the tension between us was palpable. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same questions. What will this mean for us? How will we explain this to our families? What if we lose everything? At first, we tried to talk openly about it. I poured my heart out to him, sharing everything, the way I had felt Jesus' love so powerfully, the overwhelming peace that washed over me during my experience, the faces of people I had never met who seemed to greet me in heaven. But the more I spoke, the more John retreated into silence. He wasn't rejecting me, but I could see he was struggling to reconcile the person I had become with the man he had known before. The faith that had seemed so distant for both of us was now an insurmountable chasm between us. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation, John turned to me and said, "I want to support you, but Sarah, I just don't know what to believe anymore. This is all so much. What do we do now? I'm scared of losing you." His words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth of them. I had changed, and not just in the way I had hoped. I had become someone unfamiliar to him, and the journey we had once walked together seemed to have split into two very different paths. The uncertainty gnawed at me, and as the days passed, I found myself questioning whether I had made the right choice. Was I truly meant to walk this road, or was I deluding myself with something I had misinterpreted? Doubt began to creep in, despite the clarity of my experience. Had I truly seen Jesus, or had I just experienced some sort of altered state of consciousness? Around the same time, I began to feel the weight of the reactions from my friends and family. Maria had been the first to express concern, and though she had tried to hide her reservations, I could sense her growing discomfort. Her skepticism was not just directed at the idea of my experience, but at the very idea of faith itself. She would often throw out dismissive comments when I spoke about it, attempting to make light of what I had gone through. "You know, Sarah, I get that this is important to you, but this whole Jesus is real thing is really out there," she would say with a forced smile. "I mean, if it were really that simple, why isn't everyone experiencing this?" Her words were sharp, cutting into my newfound confidence. I tried to explain, but each conversation felt like I was digging a deeper hole. How could I explain something so personal, something so unexplainable, to someone who had never felt the depth of what I had experienced? It wasn't just Maria. I noticed subtle changes in how my family treated me too. Conversations at family gatherings became strained. They didn't know what to make of this new version of me, the woman who had always been so pragmatic, so grounded in the realities of life. Now I was talking about visions, spiritual experiences, and a love I could never put into words. Some of them were curious, but most of them simply didn't understand. My mother, in particular, was a source of concern. We had never been particularly close, but the distance between us had grown even wider after I had shared my experience. She couldn't seem to grasp the depth of what had happened to me, and I could feel the judgment in her eyes whenever we spoke. "I just don't get it, Sarah," she said one evening when I tried to talk to her. "You were always so sensible, so down to earth, and now, it doesn't make any sense." Her words stung more than I expected. I had hoped for understanding, for someone to share in my joy and my newfound peace. But instead, I was met with confusion and concern. The more I tried to explain, the more I realized I was pushing people away instead of drawing them closer. It wasn't just the people around me that presented challenges. It was also the growing sense of isolation I felt within myself. I had always been a woman who believed in the tangible, the practical. Faith had never come easy to me, and now, in the midst of my spiritual awakening, I found myself torn between two worlds. The world I had known, where logic and reason ruled, and the world I had encountered in the afterlife, where love, grace, and eternity held a deeper truth. The more I tried to reconcile these two realities, the more my inner turmoil grew. Was I betraying everything I had once believed in? Was I becoming someone unrecognizable, even to myself? Each night I prayed for clarity, for peace, but the answers didn't come easily. The path I was walking was so uncertain, so full of twists and turns, that I began to wonder if I was strong enough to continue. As the days passed, I began to feel the weight of the choices I had made pressing down on me. I had never anticipated how isolating this journey would be. At first, I had thought that sharing my experience would bring people closer to me, but as I tried to explain what had happened, I realized I was only growing more distant from everyone, including myself. John and I had stopped having real conversations. The more I spoke of my faith, the more he withdrew, retreating into his own world. He had become distant, quiet, his eyes often clouded with thoughts I couldn't reach. I would sit next to him at night, but the space between us felt wider than ever. He no longer seemed to look at me with the same warmth. Instead, it was as though he were watching someone else. a stranger. I could feel his confusion, his fear, but I couldn't find the words to ease his pain. I longed to tell him how much I loved him, how much I needed him by my side, but the words felt inadequate. One night, after a particularly long day, I found him sitting in the living room, staring at the television but not really watching. I approached him cautiously, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had formed between us. "John," I said softly, sitting beside him, "can we talk? Please." He looked at me, his eyes tired. "Sarah, I don't know what to say anymore. I don't want to hurt you, but I'm struggling with all of this. I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't know how to stop it." I swallowed the lump in my throat. His words felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "I don't want to lose you either," I whispered. "But this is who I am now. I can't ignore what I saw, what I felt. Jesus showed me a love I never knew was possible. I have to share that with the world. I have to." He leaned back, rubbing his forehead. "I get it, Sarah. I know this means a lot to you, but I just don't know if I can keep up with this new version of you. You've changed, and I don't know how to be part of this. I don't know how to love you the way you need me to." The words hit me like a slap, but I couldn't argue with him. I had changed. I knew that. My whole worldview had shifted. But did that mean I had to lose the person I loved the most? The fear of that possibility gnawed at me. I wanted to scream, to beg him to understand, but instead, I simply sat there, silent, feeling the distance grow between us. Maria's reactions were no easier to bear. Her skepticism had turned into something colder. It was as though the more I shared, the more she distanced herself. At first, she had tried to be supportive, asking me questions about my experience, but the more I spoke of the love I had felt, the more she pulled away. Her comments had become increasingly sharp. "Sarah," she said one day when I was telling her about a dream I had, "I just don't get it. This whole thing sounds like something out of a book, not real life. Maybe you're just going through something. You don't need to make it a religious thing." I stared at her, my heart breaking. How could she not see what I had experienced? How could she not feel the depth of it? I tried to explain again, but she just shook her head as though she couldn't understand what had happened to me, or worse, didn't want to. "You know, I used to admire your strength, your groundedness," Maria continued, her voice soft but biting. "But now, I don't know who you are anymore. You've lost your way, Sarah." Her words struck me to the core. For years, Maria had been my anchor, my rock, but now she was the one pushing me away. I wanted to tell her how much I still needed her, how much I wanted her to understand. But something in her eyes told me it was too late. She had already made up her mind. And then there were the nights when the doubt crept in, when I couldn't sleep because my mind was racing. Was this real? Had I really seen Jesus? Or had I simply imagined it, creating a comforting fantasy to make sense of my near-death experience? I questioned myself more than I wanted to admit. I had always prided myself on my rationality, but now nothing seemed rational anymore. I'd lie awake, replaying every detail of the experience, the way I had felt Jesus' presence, the vivid colors, the faces of strangers who welcomed me. How could I possibly explain something so profound, something that seemed to defy all logic and reason? And how could I share this with a world that didn't believe? The struggle within me was so real, so raw. It felt like I was caught between two worlds, the one I had always known and the one I was now trying to understand. But the more I tried to hold on to both, the more I felt myself slipping away from the person I had once been. I wasn't sure where I fit anymore. I wasn't sure if I could ever go back to the way things were. Just when I thought things couldn't get any more complicated, they did. My life began to unravel in ways I hadn't prepared for, each new twist pulling me deeper into the mystery of what I had experienced. It wasn't just the rejection from my closest friends and family, it was the unexplainable events that started to surround me. It began with dreams. At first, they were subtle, just flashes of faces and places I didn't recognize, but over time, they became more vivid, more real. One night, I dreamt I was standing in a field under a sky that wasn't quite like anything I had seen on Earth. It was as though the colors weren't just colors, they seemed to radiate with a life of their own. In the distance, I saw a figure, a man standing with his back to me, his silhouette illuminated by a brilliant light. I knew immediately it was Jesus. I tried to call out to him, but my voice was lost in the wind. I stepped forward, and as I did, the figure turned. His face was so vivid, so clear, I could see every detail. The skin tone, so rich, so dark, not the pale image I had always seen in paintings or films, but a deep, warm brown. His eyes were not just brown, but pools of liquid compassion that seemed to gaze straight into my soul. He didn't speak, but his gaze was all I needed. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming wave of love and peace, a feeling that seemed to transcend everything I had ever known. I woke up from that dream, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never experienced anything like it before. The sensation of his presence lingered long after the dream had faded. I knew it wasn't just a dream. It was as though Jesus himself was trying to reach me again, to reaffirm the truth I had seen during my near-death experience. But the more I tried to process these dreams, the more confused I became. Were they real? Was I receiving some kind of divine message, or was I simply imagining things? My logical mind screamed that it was just my subconscious, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but my heart told me otherwise. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a sign, a calling to something greater than I had ever known. I began to seek answers, diving deeper into the Bible and spiritual teachings. I attended church more frequently, hoping for some clarity, some confirmation that what I had experienced was real. But instead of finding peace, I found even more questions. The contradictions between what I was learning in church and what I had experienced in my near-death journey were becoming harder to ignore. One day, after a particularly intense church service, I found myself alone in a quiet room, my Bible open in front of me. I prayed, asking God for guidance. "Please," I whispered, "I need to know the truth. I need to understand what's happening to me. Is this real? Is this your will?" As if in response, I felt a sudden, overwhelming presence fill the room. The air grew thick, heavy with a sense of holiness, and for a brief moment, I felt the same peace that had washed over me during my near-death experience. My body trembled, and I felt as though I were on the verge of something incredible. My mind raced. Was this a vision? A sign? Or was I losing my grip on reality? In that moment, I heard a whisper, soft but clear. "Trust. Let go of your fear." The voice was gentle but filled with authority, like a loving parent guiding their child. I felt an incredible warmth spread through me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. Whatever doubts I had been carrying seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by a sense of deep trust that everything would be okay. But the peace didn't last long. As I left the church that day, I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of isolation once again. The doubts started to return, and with them, the fear. If what I had experienced was real, if Jesus truly had shown me his face and his love, then why were the people around me still so skeptical? Why was my family so resistant to the truth I had found? And why did I feel so alone in this? The tension between me and John continued to escalate. I could see the frustration in his eyes whenever I tried to talk to him about my experiences. "Sarah," he would say, "I know this is important to you, but I don't understand. I don't know how to help you with this. It's like you're becoming a different person, and I don't know how to keep up." His words echoed in my mind as I lay awake that night. How could I explain something so deep, so transformative to someone who didn't share my vision? How could I make him understand when I didn't even understand everything myself? Maria's skepticism, too, began to take on a sharper edge. She would joke about my religious phase, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The distance between us grew even wider, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness for the friendship I felt slipping away. It wasn't just my relationships with them that were changing, it was my entire sense of self. The more I embraced this new path, the more I seemed to lose everything else. The truth was becoming harder to ignore, but it was also becoming harder to carry. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something monumental, something that could either bring everything together or tear it all apart. Every part of me, my mind, my heart, my relationships, was being pulled in different directions. But in the midst of all the confusion, I couldn't deny the pull of the truth that was slowly revealing itself to me. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know where this journey would lead. But I knew that I had to keep moving forward. I had to trust that Jesus, the one who had shown me his face and his love, would guide me through the storm. As the days passed, it became clear that my spiritual journey was not something I could keep hidden. What I had experienced in my near-death encounter, the dreams, the sense of a higher calling, it was spilling into my daily life, affecting every conversation and every relationship. And while I had hoped that those closest to me would embrace the changes, I found myself at the center of growing tension and unexpected support. John's distance grew more pronounced. The man I had once shared everything with now seemed like a stranger. He no longer initiated conversations, and the quiet nights that once brought comfort now felt heavy, filled with unsaid words. I had tried to talk to him, to explain that this wasn't something I could simply turn off, but he didn't want to hear it anymore. The space between us was suffocating, and yet I couldn't bring myself to let go. One evening, I sat in our small living room, my hands clutching a worn Bible, trying to find solace in its pages, but all I could hear were the echoes of John's voice, his hurt and frustration. I glanced up as I heard the door open, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes dark with uncertainty. "You're really gone, aren't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was a sadness in his eyes, a longing I couldn't ignore. "I'm still here, John. I'm still the same person," I said, trying to bridge the gap between us. "But this is part of who I am now. I can't deny it. I can't just pretend it didn't happen." He sighed heavily and stepped forward, sitting down next to me. His presence, though familiar, felt foreign now. "I just don't understand. I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't know how to fix it." The raw pain in his words made my heart ache, but I couldn't bring myself to offer false comfort. "John, this is real. I've seen something so powerful, so beautiful, that I can't turn my back on it. But I don't want to lose you either. I don't want to be alone in this." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine, as though trying to find the woman he once knew. Finally, he reached out, placing a hand on mine. "I don't know what to say, Sarah. I just don't know." Maria, too, had become more distant, but in a different way. While John was quiet and withdrawn, Maria had grown more vocal in her criticism. Every time I spoke of my experiences, her eyes narrowed and her words became sharper. "You need to snap out of this, Sarah. This whole Jesus showed me his face thing is just too much. You're losing yourself in this delusion." I had tried to reason with her, to explain that I wasn't deluded, that what I had experienced was real. But every time I spoke, her skepticism turned into something colder. "You've always been the rational one," she would say. "What happened to that person? You can't just throw everything away because of one experience. This isn't you." I could feel the rift between us widening, the friendship we had once shared slipping through my fingers. Maria wasn't just questioning my beliefs. She was questioning who I had become, and in doing so, questioning me. The emotional toll was immense. I had always relied on her to keep me grounded, to remind me of who I was. But now, she seemed like another person entirely, someone I couldn't quite reach. And then there were the moments of unexpected support. Ruth, an older woman I had met at church, had begun to notice the turmoil I was going through. She had always been a quiet presence in my life, but one Sunday after service, she pulled me aside. "Sarah," she said gently, her hands warm on mine, "I see the light in you. I see the change, and I can tell it's a good one. Don't let the fear of others stop you. I've been where you are, feeling like no one understands, but I can promise you this, God is leading you. Keep following him, no matter what." Her words, so simple and yet so profound, were a lifeline. Ruth had been a quiet presence, but in that moment I felt like she was my anchor, reminding me that I wasn't alone. She wasn't the only one. Other members of the church had started reaching out, offering their prayers and support. But I couldn't shake the feeling that those who truly understood were the ones who had already been through something similar. They, like Ruth, had walked the hard road of faith, and they knew the struggles I was facing. In the midst of all this, I found myself torn between the two worlds I was living in. On one hand, I had my new faith, my growing understanding of God's love, which felt so real and powerful. On the other, I had the people I loved who didn't understand what I had experienced and were pulling away from me. I had never felt so torn. I tried to find peace in prayer, asking God for clarity, but the questions kept coming. Should I continue pushing for people to understand? Or should I focus on my own path, trusting that those who were meant to walk with me would find their way? My mind felt like a battlefield, the conflicting emotions pushing and pulling me in different directions. What troubled me most was the sense that I was losing the people I cared about the most: John, Maria, even the church community that had once embraced me so warmly. The rift between us felt too wide to bridge, and the fear of losing everything was almost overwhelming. But in the quiet moments, when I closed my eyes and remembered the love I had felt during my near-death experience, I knew that I had no choice but to keep moving forward, even if it meant walking alone. The tension in my life had reached a boiling point. Every aspect of my world, my relationships, my sense of self, even my faith, felt like it was hanging by a thread. I had been holding on to the belief that everything would somehow fall into place, that my family and friends would eventually come to understand what I had experienced, that they would see the light I had seen. But as time went on, it became clear that things weren't going to get easier. They were only getting harder. John had grown colder, his frustration now turning to quiet resentment. It was like he no longer knew how to look at me without feeling betrayed by the person I had become. Our arguments had become more frequent, and they always ended in silence, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Too much had been said, and too much had been left unsaid. It was as though we were living in two separate worlds, unable to connect, unable to reconcile our differences. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, my mind racing with doubt and fear, I felt a strong urge to pray. I had been praying a lot lately, but tonight felt different. I wasn't just praying for peace or for guidance. I was praying for a decision, a clear answer to the overwhelming uncertainty I was living with. "Lord," I whispered, my voice breaking, "I don't know what to do. Everything is falling apart. Please show me what I'm supposed to do. I can't keep living like this." As soon as the words left my lips, I felt a wave of emotion crash over me, a deep, undeniable sense of God's presence filling the room. It was overwhelming, and for a moment, I thought I might drown in it. But then something happened, something that I had not expected. I felt a pull, a calling that seemed to come from deep within my soul. It was as if the very core of my being was being shaken, torn between two paths. The first path was the one I had been walking, the one I had embraced after my near-death experience. It was the path of faith, of understanding, of trusting in the love and guidance of Jesus. It was a path that had brought me peace and joy, but it had also come with a cost. The rejection of those closest to me, the growing distance between me and the life I had once known. The second path was the one that led back to the world I had known before, back to the comfort of familiar relationships, to the security of old beliefs, to the life I had shared with John, Maria, and my family. But this path felt empty now, hollow, as though it could no longer offer the meaning I had found in my spiritual awakening. And then in the quiet of that moment, I heard a voice that wasn't just in my mind, but in the very air around me. It was soft, yet powerful, full of compassion and authority. "Trust me," the voice said. "You must choose, Sarah. Choose the path that leads you to me, and do not fear the cost. I will be with you, always." The words settled deep in my heart, and suddenly, everything became clear. I had been waiting for something, some external sign, some moment of clarity that would make the decision easier. But the truth was, the choice had always been mine. It wasn't about waiting for everything to line up perfectly or for everyone to understand. It was about following the truth that had been revealed to me, even if it meant walking alone. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me as I realized what I had to do. I had to let go of the relationships that were holding me back, let go of the fear of rejection, and let go of the life that no longer fit who I had become. The love and truth I had found in Jesus was worth everything, even if it meant losing the people I loved. The next day, I made the hardest decision of my life. I sat down with John. His face, tired and guarded, met mine as I spoke. "John, I've made a choice," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I can't keep living this way. I know it's hard to understand, but I can't deny what I've experienced. I have to follow Jesus, even if that means everything changes, even if that means we have to go our separate ways." He looked at me, his eyes a mixture of pain and disbelief. So that's it? You're just going to leave everything behind? I'm not leaving everything behind, I replied, tears welling up in my eyes. But I can't stay in this place of limbo, John. I need to follow what's true. I can't keep pretending I'm the same person I was before. He stood up, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and sadness. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Sarah. I don't know how to be with someone who's so different from the woman I married. I nodded, my heart breaking, but there was a deep, unshakable conviction within me. I understand, John, but this is the only way I can find peace. I have to follow my heart, my truth. He turned away, his shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought I might lose him forever. But I knew in that moment that the choice was right, even if it was painful. I was choosing the truth I had found in Jesus, and nothing could replace that. As I walked away, my heart felt heavy, but I also felt free, as though I had taken the first step on a path I could no longer turn back from. The pain of letting go was real, but the peace of following God's call was even stronger. The days following my conversation with John felt like a blur. The weight of my decision pressed down on me, but with each passing moment, I felt more certain that it had been the right one. Even as the pain of separation lingered, I knew I was on the right path. But the challenges were far from over. If anything, they were just beginning. John had moved out. The emptiness of the house echoed with his absence, a silence that was both a relief and a deep ache. I had expected it, had even braced myself for it, but the reality of being alone was harder than I had imagined. I spent long hours praying, seeking God's comfort, but in the quiet moments, doubt crept in. Was I truly doing the right thing? Had I made a decision that would cost me everything? But it wasn't just John's departure that weighed on me. It was the growing isolation from my community, my friends, my family, even the people at church. Ruth, the woman who had supported me, had begun to distance herself too. I hadn't heard from her in weeks, and when I finally saw her at church one Sunday, her eyes were filled with a mix of sadness and concern. "Sarah," she said gently, "I know this journey has been hard for you, but I worry that you're moving too fast. Sometimes when people experience something so profound, they can get caught up in emotions. I just want to make sure you're not pushing too far, too fast." I felt the sting of her words, but there was something deeper in her concern. She wasn't rejecting me, but she was warning me. The truth I had found was powerful, but it was also dangerous. It was not something that could be easily explained or understood by those who had not experienced it themselves. And I was beginning to realize just how much I had to lose. I tried to explain, to share the depth of what I had encountered, but it was like speaking a language no one else understood. "Ruth, I know it's hard, but this isn't something I can just let go of. This truth, this love, it's everything. I've seen it, I've felt it, and I can't go back." She nodded slowly, her face creased with concern. "I know, Sarah, but sometimes when we follow God's call, we have to be careful not to lose ourselves in it. The road ahead will be harder than you think." Her words echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. Was I losing myself in this? Had I made a decision that would cost me not only John and my family, but my entire identity? The next few days were filled with a sense of emotional turbulence. I found myself torn between the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. I longed for the comfort of the old me, the woman who hadn't known the kind of pain I was experiencing now, the woman who had never felt so completely alone. But I knew I couldn't go back. I had chosen this path, and it was one that required everything of me. The confrontation with Ruth had stirred up something inside me, a fear that I hadn't fully acknowledged. I had believed that following Jesus would lead to peace, that it would be a journey of love and acceptance. But now, I was beginning to see the cost of that choice. It wasn't just about rejection from my family or friends. It was about losing parts of myself, parts that I didn't know I would have to sacrifice. The comfort of certainty, the security of knowing where I stood, these were things I had given up without fully realizing how precious they were. But even in the midst of the confusion, something else began to stir in my soul, a deep, unshakable conviction that this path, no matter how difficult, was the one I was meant to walk. It was in the quiet moments, when I felt the weight of the loss, that I also felt a glimmer of something greater. something far beyond the struggles I was facing, something that whispered to me, "You are not alone. I am with you." The call to follow Jesus was not one that came without cost, but it was one that promised something far greater than anything I had left behind. And in the depth of my doubt, I knew I had to keep moving forward. One night, after a particularly difficult conversation with Maria, who had become more vocal in her disapproval, I found myself at the church again. The sanctuary was empty, save for a few candles flickering softly in the dim light. I sank to my knees, my heart raw and open. "Lord," I whispered, "I don't know if I can do this anymore. I'm so tired. I feel like I'm losing everything." The stillness of the church enveloped me, and in that moment I felt it, the peace that had been so elusive. It wasn't the peace of an easy life, but the peace that comes with knowing that you are exactly where you are meant to be. "You are not alone," the voice whispered again, the one that had first spoken to me in the quiet of my room. "Keep trusting, keep walking, I am with you." And in that moment, I made my decision. I would not turn back. I would keep walking, even when the path was unclear, even when the cost seemed too great. I had chosen this journey, and I would follow it through, no matter what. The storm inside me had been building for months, but now it was at its height. Every conversation, every relationship, every moment felt as though it was pulling me in different directions. My mind was consumed by the conflict between the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. There were moments when I could feel the old me tugging at me, whispering that I could turn back, that I didn't have to face the loneliness, the rejection, or the fear of being misunderstood. But the truth that had changed me so deeply, would not let me go. John had not come back, and the silence between us had grown more profound. I had heard rumors that he had started seeing someone else, and the thought of him moving on, of him finding peace while I was still locked in my own internal battle, cut deeper than I cared to admit. It was hard not to feel abandoned, not just by him, but by everyone who had once been a part of my life. And then there was Maria. Our relationship had become a battlefield. What had once been a close bond was now fractured, filled with angry words, cold silences, and a growing sense of betrayal. "How can you do this, Sarah?" she had asked just days before. "How can you turn your back on everything we've known, on everything that made us who we are? You're breaking my heart. You're breaking the family apart." Her words cut through me like a knife, and I found myself at a crossroads. I had never wanted to hurt anyone, especially not Maria. But the love I had found in Jesus was far more powerful than any familial bond or worldly tie. Yet as I stood in the quiet of my own thoughts, I questioned if I could truly move forward without completely losing everything. Then came the night that pushed me to my breaking point. I had gone to church, hoping for some peace, some sense of direction, but instead, I found myself face to face with Ruth. She was waiting for me outside the church, her eyes filled with concern. "Sarah, we need to talk," she said softly, her voice strained with emotion. We found a quiet spot in the garden, away from the others. The cool night air was thick with tension. I could see the struggle in her face, the same fear that had been gnawing at me for months. "Sarah," Ruth began, her voice trembling, "I've seen how much you've changed. I know you've had a powerful experience, and I don't doubt what you've seen. But you're pushing people away, you're isolating yourself, and I fear you're heading down a dangerous path." "I'm not isolating myself, Ruth," I replied, my voice sharp. "I'm following the truth I saw in that moment when I met him. I can't deny it, and I can't go back." "I understand," she said, her eyes softening. "But truth is a heavy burden to carry, and you're carrying it alone. I'm afraid you'll lose everything for it." Her words hit me harder than I expected. What if I was alone in this? What if the price of following Jesus was simply too high? What if in the end I would be left with nothing but my faith, and even that, would it be enough? Could I endure the isolation? As Ruth walked away, her words echoed in my mind. I had made a choice to follow a truth that no one else seemed to understand, and now I was beginning to see the cost of that choice. The weight of it was suffocating, and I wondered if I could truly carry it alone. The next few days were filled with restless nights and fleeting moments of peace, as if the very act of living had become a test. I prayed more fervently, seeking God's reassurance, seeking clarity. "Lord," I whispered. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. I'm so tired. I've lost so much. Is this really what you want?" The silence that followed was deafening. No answer came, no voice spoke, but in that silence I felt something stirring deep inside me. It was a peace that didn't come from understanding, but from knowing. A peace that said, "Even if you lose everything, even if the world turns its back on you, you are mine. I have called you, and you will never walk alone." I stood in the stillness of that moment, a wave of clarity sweeping over me. The pain, the fear, the isolation, they were all real, but they were temporary. The truth I had discovered, the love I had felt, was eternal. I couldn't turn back. I wouldn't turn back. And even if the road ahead was filled with hardship, I knew I had to continue walking it. There was no other choice. In that quiet moment, everything shifted. The doubt, the fear, the anxiety, they faded into the background, replaced by a quiet, unshakable conviction. I was not alone. I was never alone. Jesus was with me, and that truth would carry me forward, no matter what came. It was a Sunday morning, and I found myself at the church again, though this time I didn't know if I was searching for peace or for a sign. The chaos of my emotions had reached a boiling point, and I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that everything was about to change. I had walked this road of faith, but it had come with more pain than I had ever imagined. The loss, the rejection, the constant questioning, it was all so overwhelming. But this morning, something felt different. There was an energy in the air, a stillness that seemed to settle over the room as I walked in. The usual hum of voices, the murmur of prayers, seemed distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that something divine was about to happen. I sat in my usual spot, the seat I'd claimed so many months ago, but today it felt like a stranger to me. I felt a stirring deep within my soul, as if the walls of this place were no longer just a building, but a threshold to something far greater. As the service began, I listened to the hymns being sung, but the words felt distant, disconnected. I wanted to feel them. I wanted to find comfort in them, but the truth I had encountered was so much more than any song or sermon could offer. The reality of what I had seen in my near-death experience, the face of Jesus, his love, his grace, the understanding he had given me, was overwhelming. It was a presence so powerful that it made everything else seem insignificant in comparison. As the pastor began his message, I found my thoughts drifting. I wasn't looking for answers in his words anymore. I was seeking something else. And then in the middle of his sermon, something happened. A stillness washed over the room, and the noise of the world seemed to disappear. It was as if the entire universe held its breath. And there in the quiet, I felt it, the presence of God. The presence that had been with me all along, but now it was so tangible, so real. My heart raced as I felt a warmth flood over me, a sense of comfort that went deeper than anything I had ever known. It was as if Jesus himself had stepped into the room and was standing right beside me. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, everything that had once been uncertain became crystal clear. I saw him again, the face of Jesus, just as I had seen it in my near-death experience. But this time it wasn't a fleeting vision, it was a reality. I saw him standing before me, his face radiant with light. His skin was dark, as I had seen before, but it wasn't just about his appearance. It was his eyes, the deep, compassionate eyes that held an understanding beyond human comprehension. They looked at me, and in that moment, I knew he understood every part of my struggle, every ounce of pain, every doubt I had ever carried. "Sarah," he spoke, though his voice wasn't audible. It was a voice I felt in my heart, a voice that pierced through the depths of my soul. "You are not alone. You have never been alone. I have always been with you, even when you felt abandoned, even when you questioned everything. My love for you is not bound by your understanding, nor by your doubts." I could hardly breathe. The love in his voice, unfathomable, unconditional, pure, it wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I was overwhelmed by the presence of his love. And in that moment, I realized that everything I had experienced, every challenge, every heartache, was leading me to this one truth. I was deeply, profoundly loved by him. The tears came without warning, and I couldn't stop them. They weren't just tears of sorrow, they were tears of release, tears of surrender. In that instant, all the weight I had been carrying, the guilt, the fear, the isolation, it lifted. I was no longer bound by the expectations of others, by the fear of rejection. The truth of God's love washed over me, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was forgiven. I was loved. I was free. The pastor's voice faded into the background as I sat there fully present in this moment. It felt as though time had stopped. There was no more struggle, no more doubt, only peace. The journey I had been on, the pain, the loss, the transformation, had led me here to this moment of pure, unadulterated grace. And in the stillness of that moment, I knew my life would never be the same again. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky but my heart stronger than ever. The service continued around me, but I no longer felt like a bystander. I was a part of something greater, something eternal. I had found my way home, not just to the church, but to the very heart of God. The love I had encountered that day was not just a feeling, it was a truth. It was a love that transcended every moment of fear, every moment of pain. It was a love that had the power to heal, to restore, to transform. And from that moment on, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. I wasn't just Sarah anymore. I was a daughter of the King, loved beyond measure, and my journey was only just beginning. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything I've been through, I'm struck by how far I've come. The woman I was, the one who lived in fear and confusion, the one who felt abandoned and unworthy, she's no longer me. She is a part of my past, a part of my story, but she no longer defines who I am. The woman I am now is a new creation, someone who has been healed by grace, transformed by love, and empowered by a truth that surpasses all understanding. It hasn't been easy. The road I've walked has been filled with heartache, rejection, and more questions than I ever imagined I'd have to face. But in every moment of pain, in every struggle, I have found one constant: God's love. It has never wavered, it has never failed, and it has carried me through every storm. When I first encountered Jesus, I was overwhelmed with awe. His presence, His truth, His love, they changed me in ways I couldn't even explain. But what I didn't realize then was that this journey wasn't just about receiving something. It was about becoming something, becoming the person God had always intended for me to be. The woman who was no longer afraid to stand up for what she believed, the woman who had the strength to walk away from her past and embrace the future He had set before her. I know there are still days when I struggle, when the weight of my past tries to pull me back, when doubt creeps in, but I've learned something invaluable on this journey. I am not defined by my mistakes. I am defined by His love. I am defined by His grace. And every day, I am learning to walk in the freedom He has given me. The moment I saw Jesus, the moment I felt His love in a way I could never have imagined, it was more than just a spiritual experience. It was a turning point in my life. And now I realize that my purpose isn't just to live out this story for myself, but to share it with others. To let them know that no matter what they've been through, no matter how lost they may feel, there is always hope. There is always grace. There is always a path back to Him. If you're watching this and you felt lost, abandoned, or uncertain, know that you are not alone. The same love that found me, that pulled me out of the darkness, is waiting for you. All it takes is a step, one step toward the truth that can transform your life. I know it's hard. I know it feels impossible sometimes. But if God can take someone like me, broken, lost, and full of doubt, and turn my life around, He can do the same for you. I want to invite you to reflect on your own journey, your own beliefs. Take a moment to consider where you are in your own life. Are you ready for change? Are you ready to step into the love and grace that's waiting for you? Jesus offers healing, freedom, and peace, but He can only do that if you open your heart to Him. As you go forward, remember that this is not the end of the story. It's just the beginning. There are more chapters to write, and with God by your side, you will write them with grace, hope, and a love that never fails. If Sarah's story has touched your heart, if you felt the stirring in your own soul, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with others who may be looking for hope, healing, and a transformation just like Sarah's. Let us know where you're from and what part of your journey you're on. We'd love to hear your story and support you in your walk with God. Remember, no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, Jesus is waiting for you. He loves you, He sees you, and He is calling you to come home.